My name is Dr.Thomas A.Carrasco. Thanks. Cool. So I'm the chair of American Ethics Studies here at Santa Barbara City College. Thank you all so much for coming. This is part of a series called Courageous Conversations for Outrageous Times. I'd like to acknowledge our dean, Priscilla Mora, up there, who we've collaborated. This is the second year that we're doing this. Santa Barbara City College is a big supporter of Chicano Latino culture, students. A lot of this comes from Title V money. And so when I was asked to present, to create a series on our culture, on our communities, one of the things that I do as a scholar, and I'm also in a comedy troupe called Chicano Secret Service. So one of my strategies in life, I attempt to ignore the dominant culture as best as possible, okay? So that means that I try to focus in on my student, on Santa Barbara, on Oxnard, on Santa Maria, on the communities of Santa Barbara that we address. And so my natural reaction, I'm not going to regurgitate the negative images that have been coming from the White House to our communities. So what I did, last year we did a Chicano culture, right? A conference, and we did teaching methodologies. This semester I'm bringing in Harry Gamboa, who's one of our landmark artists of not only Los Angeles, but world-renowned photographer, writer, author. And so this is the first part of that series. And then we're going to be having a conference on September 21st called Chicano Time 2019. And it's 500 years of Tenochtitlan and 50 years of Chicano studies. So again, the focus is on the positiveness that's coming from our communities, and also just to subvert what's going on nationally, right? To subvert literally children in cages, to subvert the attacks on immigrants, to subvert ignorance in a general sense, right? With knowledge, with education. Santa Barbara City College is almost 40% Mexican-American, Chicano, Hispanic. So in the spirit of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement and the Chicano Power movement, women's rights movement, we are creating new forms of knowledge to emancipate students, new forms of knowledge to create that global citizen, right? To be part of society. And so one of the things I ask my students, are you conditioned to take orders, or are you conditioned to run society, right? And so those are the challenges, and we have a lot of students. One of the things that we love here at Santa Barbara City College is that we change lives. Along with the 50 years of Chicano studies, we're celebrating 50 years of educational opportunity programs, EOPS, right? So in the midst of this very, very conservative era, we have a lot of amazing, progressive, educational goals that have been made, and that we're still contributing to society in a positive note. So one of the concepts, those of you that are my students from Chicano Popular Culture, so I teach Chicano Popular Culture, Introduction to Chicano Studies, and History of Racism. That's the classes that I teach in ethnic studies. So if you look at what, this is a definition, the theory that I teach, it's called Chicana Rhetorics, Chicano Culture. So a lot of times people see rhetoric as just words, but I'm utilizing rhetoric as film, rhetoric as poetry, rhetoric as performance, and so to convince the world that we do exist in a positive context, right? And so if you look at this definition, is to analyze how Mesoamerican and Western cultural materials intersect and interact to produce new possibilities, through a dynamic strategy of mestizo invention. So we're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of years of history, right? When the Spanish came over, they did horrible things to the indigenous people, and the product was us. the modern day Mexican. These are hard histories, right? So we have Mexican, European, American equals Chicano, Chicana, Mexican, Mexican American, Latino, Latino, Hispanic culture. And that's what I'm presenting to you today. So a perfect example of mestizo invention is Vamos a la Store. And why does Vamos a la Store make sense to us? Because we're living in two worlds at one time. That's a great joke, y'all. You are very serious. You know, you never been to the store? Okay? So again, but it's like, I teach this concept called Nepantla. Nepantla is living in two worlds at one time, right? And so again, Chicano popular culture, this is just the way we teach, the way we locate the Chicana experience in the United States, right? So I'm one of those professors that just loves definitions, and so I wanted to introduce you to that, and also my students that are learning this. So I present to you from the original Tongva Basin. This is that evolved into the Los Angeles Basin, and we study Los Angeles as a city-state, as we would study Tikal, as we would study Athens, as city-states, right? So Los Angeles is a city-state, and the reason why I like to frame it as a city-state is that Los Angeles is 4 to 5 million people, about 15 million people in the basin. It's a cultural center of Chicana Mexican culture, right? For a couple of hundred years, which is connected to Mexico City. Mexico City is the original Tenochtitlan, right, that was destroyed by the Spaniards, and that Mexico City rose from those ashes, right? And it's connected. Harry Gamboa is the co-director of Cal Arts. He is an author, he is an artist. I had mentioned that I'm in a comedy troupe called Chicano Secret Service. Harry Gamboa was one of the first political activists that kind of took us under his wing. Harry enters this conversation in the 50s and 60s with the East LA blowouts, a major creator, founder of ASCO. Those of you that don't know what ASCO is, Google it. No, I'm joking. ASCO is like you want to throw up, right? Kind of, sort of, but it's like this performance, a landmark performance art group that Harry was part of and has kept on evolving. That's what separates Harry from a lot of other people. He has continued to evolve as a photographer, as a writer, as a theorist, as an essayist. His books are Urban Exiled, Collective Writings of Harry Gamboa, Worker Ant, amongst many, many other books. Harry, I put re-exiled, so he does this whole thing about the urban oasis in Los Angeles. And again, Harry grew up in the middle of like the 60, the 10, and the 5, was eyewitness to just a lot of really, really horrible situations in East LA, and he was able to subvert it and show the world what was happening. LA is a city that has imprisoned more people than any other city in the history of the world. It is, for the last 150 years, 500 people a day have moved to Los Angeles. And not just Mexicans, okay? So a lot of people go to LA, right? And so again, it's a center, and at this time, I would like to introduce you to Harry Gamboa Jr.
There we go, okay. Play. How do we play now? Oh, there you go. Okay, I get it. There we go. I think I'm on. Hello, everyone. I'll be clicking away at some of the images. It'll be slightly in sequence. The images you'll see here are from 1972 to 2017. But I'll kind of start at the beginning. We'll start with this as just an image as a backdrop, but just to kind of contextualize my own background, I was born in 1951 in Los Angeles. That is the same year that they began the atomic tests in Nevada. In Nevada, they blew up nearly 1,000 nuclear bombs. My group of young people of that era were all exposed to the fallout of 1,000 nuclear bombs. So immediately I was introduced to mass death as a result of nuclear power. Many of my friends in elementary school died of leukemia. In middle school, of course, other kinds of illnesses. The thing about nuclear material is that each and every bomb had a specific, very specific register. So my body actually contains the unique atomic signature of every explosion that took place in Nevada, which is why the government is very interested in my body when I die. They have declared that they're going to own one of my bones for their completion data. I haven't figured out which bone. We'll actually have you all vote later, and you could tell me. One of the things about if the nuclear bomb doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. So suddenly I have a free battery, okay? So one of the things about this particular image, which is titled Spray Paint Lacma, and this was taken place in 1972. By 1972, I was 21 years of age. I had already been through the entire public school system in Los Angeles. I had attended Garfield High School when it was considered the worst performing school in the entire United States. It had the highest dropout rate, the lowest reading scores. It had everything that was wrong with it. Part of this thing about East Los Angeles, which I wasn't exactly clear of while I was living there, but actually doing after extensive research, it turns out that East LA and Boyle Heights in particular were actually military experimental locations, as well as other kinds of social experimentation of crowd control, police weaponry, again, nuclear materials, medical systems, educational systems, all these kinds of things that would be used to subvert democracy, to subvert human behavior, which would then, after being tested, could then be exported to the rest of the country, which is actually on show currently now. And so, and this all takes time, and this all results after World War II. And so I'm a baby boomer, and one of the survivors of this situation. And by the time this event took place, which I haven't described yet, I had lived through much social unrest, had been confronted by police shooting their weapons at peaceful protesters. I've written many articles about having survived many instances like that in East LA. There was something known as a Chicano moratorium and other kinds of events. And actually, when I was a young student leader at the age of 15, I came to the attention of Richard Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover and was placed on a list basically to be eliminated from the American landscape. Fortunately, I was informed that my name was in a publication that I purchased at the Federal Building. I decided to change my status from activist to artist. And within 10 years, I received a very shining letter from President Jimmy Carter, who gave me a big giant check and said I was a great American artist. And because another president got jealous, Ronald Reagan actually sent me even a much more flowing letter and twice the amount. So it's possible to be at both ends at once. This particular image was taken in 1972 after I had taken a friend of mine to go look at the exhibition at LA County Museum of Art. And one of the things that Tomas mentioned was that Los Angeles is actually the second largest Mexican city in the world. The first one is Mexico City. The second one is Los Angeles. And LA County, of course, depends on taxes, of which many people pay taxes. And so when I went to, and I was born in Los Angeles, and my father served in the military in World War II, and so did all my relatives. And so very much an American. Went to go visit the museum, and I was very upset, particularly after having spent most of my life at that point working on behalf of the civil rights movement and Chicano rights movement, to find that the museum had not a single work of Chicano art on display. And I wound up just pounding on doors. And before you knew it, I wound up in the inner sanctum of the lead curators, the chief curator of the museum, and asked him why they have no Chicano art. And of course, he's a very famous guy, was pouring a martini at the time, and he turned back and he says, well, you know, Chicanos don't make art, they're in gangs. And so I kind of stood back and I said, wow, he's pretty quick, but maybe I'm quicker. And returned later that evening with two other artists that I had worked with at that point. We had just started working together, which was Grunk and Willie Heron. And we decided that we would sign the lower right-hand corner of the museum itself, thus creating the museum to be the first work of art to be exhibited there. And so I took this photograph and I brought Patsy Valdez to photograph her the next morning. This spray painting remained there only 4 hours. It was whitewashed. Very few people actually saw it, but utilizing the medium of photography, particularly the kind of film that I would use at that point, which was known as Ektachrome 400, which was similar to cinematic stock, the same kind of film that was used to make your favorite Hollywood movies, to create this kind of effect, making it seem like an important moment. At that point, it was only a single 35 millimeter slide, of which I made several hundred duplicate copies, and this is before the internet. I mailed them directly to scholars, editors, other people that seemed to be interesting, people I became aware of through my research, and mailed it to them directly so they could look and put in their own slide projectors to look at the work. At that point, people started talking about this image, and it reverberated for 40 years until there was an exhibition titled Phantom Sightings in maybe around 2010, I believe, in which this image was finally shown inside the museum. This work also, for instance, is titled Instant Mural, and again, this was taken on the street corner of Whittier in Arizona, where a massacre had taken place, where LA County sheriffs opened fire, 25 police officers opened fire and hit many people and killed many people, and martial law was imposed on East LA. And so for me, every time they tell me not to go outside is when I decide to play. And we went out here and we created a mural that would last the duration of how long it takes to tape people together with a roll of tape. And we have Grunk taping Patsy Valdez. There was also Umberto Sandoval, I believe, who's here, was taped to the wall. It only lasted a minute. People passed by, but at that point, this would have constituted a felony, a violation. Of course, we didn't stay long enough to be arrested, but this particular image, and particularly this image, would later be used by the Getty and Bank of America as an image to promote Pacific Standard Time, and this image wound up on all the ATMs across the United States for 1 year. And I would go to the ATMs and I still never got a 20. Okay. So this image, for instance, is one that's become rather world famous. It will be shown in a very famous museum in Cologne, Germany in April, but it's shown in many museums. This is known as the First Supper after a major riot. And this was taken in 1974, and actually on the left you could see this very weird vehicle that's there, and it was a Volkswagen vehicle, and they used to call it the Thing. And so, yeah, and I think they only produced it for like 3 days or something, but this particular image, we threw a party on a traffic island. What's not told in the narrative, of course, in the single image, is that this street was actually bulldozed after the massacre to eliminate all of the evidence. And it's a very important street corner, and actually I photographed it from the position where I was standing when the police were shooting at me, just 2 years earlier. And we declared that basically martial law would be over, and actually shortly afterwards all that kind of control fell apart. But this particular image has become of great interest to Europeans and other people that talk about the usage of public space and the diminishing availability of public space, and all of this about privatization and militarization. And this was taken in 1974. And again, in this image here also, Osco is always known for having had sort of a dark sense of humor, being very satirical, dealing with various social issues. All of us attended public schools in East Los Angeles. Again, you'd have to do a little bit of research. You'd have to find that in the 1950s, when I attended school, Los Angeles was very much like apartheid South Africa. There were signs designating who could use what restrooms, who could drink what water, who could go in what swimming pools, who would get served. There was a distinct differentiation of races. There was not such a broad representation of the group of people that are there presently. We had a very specific police department that actually had received their training, and believe it or not, much of their playbook came from the Nazi regime of Munich when it was under the control of Chief Parker, who then brought that into the development of the LAPD. And it turns out it was kind of a transitional period, a very rough transitional period, when we also had a president who had been a former general in a war during the time, and during World War II, by the way. In the midst of World War II, the president at that era actually designated a platoon of soldiers to come into Los Angeles to kill Mexican boys and girls and to harm them, particularly those known as Pachucos, and basically they were the original Chicano artists. They were the ones offering an alternative to mainstream, and they posed an internal threat at that point. Which is why, again, when my name was included on a list, it was very dangerous for me, particularly because I actually posed no physical danger at all. I just had no fear of talking in front of people, and I just had the facility to meet with people, and the fact that we shut down the public schools for 10 days and costing them millions of dollars seemed to have caused somebody a problem. It turns out, of course, that through art, it is possible to reach a broader audience. This image is called The Gores, and what it was a takeoff on a group of people that would go out and designate street justice to petty thieves, and it was a big joke, of course. And this piece, believe it or not, is owned by the Whitney Museum of American Art. It's going to be showing also in Europe next year, and many people have written various papers for their dissertations on this work. Someone by the name of Eva Watalik wrote about this piece in Germany, and this piece in particular has generated great, great mirth, is that such a word, in England. This traveled all up and down the UK and was set atop over the head of the main chair in every castle, and everyone that would sit underneath it would be beneath this picture, and it was sort of a British joke, and of course they have great puns there, but the title of this piece is called Asshole Mural. Okay, and so this was taken in 1974, and at that point, believe it or not, Willie Heron and Grunk were declared internationally to be the best muralists in the world, and they were actually featured in the annual report of the Exxon Corporation. The major oil corporation featured these two artists. They became very famous amongst the wealthy, the investors. And in fact, when the ship crashed, it was Exxon Valdez, so I'm not sure if they're blaming Patsy for that. But this particular piece was in response to the fact that the media, because Los Angeles is also Hollywood, and I had early on been trained basically to intervene on the media. We were directly, OSCO quickly came to the elevated public presentation, was that because there needed to be a counter to the emerging Chicano art, because it was not falling in neatly with the kind of oppressive kind of statements, the kind of denigrating imagery that they always wanted to present in the media, to make us seem as though we were ignorant, uneducated, untalented, uncreative, as though we were foreigners on our own land, as though we were enemies of the state, with the completely wrong, absolutely. If you look at the history of the involvement of Chicanos who have defended everyone who's here today and are doing it right now, actually, very completely wrong in the direction of where the very large group of people were actually headed, and that is to self-fulfillment and to contributing to the American economy. And what they wanted to do was to create this notion that you could only be an artist. If you were Chicano, you could only be a muralist. There was no way you were going to be a conceptual artist, creating other kinds of work, fine art. And so, so I decided that we would go to Malibu, and I located where all the movie star shit comes out of, basically. And so we decided to pose with that. And of course, this has appeared in all the major art magazines. So yes, so the movie stars have seen this picture too. Okay. And this picture in particular has a resonating effect on the global culture. In the mid-1970s, we used to have, everyone would walk around in the afternoon with a newspaper under their arm. And in Los Angeles, we had two competing newspapers. One was a Hearst newspaper known as the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner. The other one was the Los Angeles Times. Both rather, even up until that point, very much involved in yellow journalism, not exactly, had not been elevated to the kind of level of journalism that people needed to have in Los Angeles at that point. And someone decided that it would be a way of selling newspapers to declare that Chicanos were always involved in gangs and in gang warfare. And one of the techniques that they utilized was if someone were to get killed in East LA, they would list the name of the victim, the name of the perpetrator, the name of the sister of the perpetrator, the name of the mother of the victim, where they lived, where they ate, where they drove, what the license plate was of their car, wherever they might be. And of course, the next week, there was retribution and somebody else was killed. And both newspapers were giving the early mapping on where to find and where to create a victim. And so I was very closely paying attention to this, and I said, well, you know, there's got to be a way to throw a monkey wrench into this machine. And so I went out and set up some road flares and put one of our artists in the middle of the street. And I, again, utilizing cinematic techniques, I photographed this work, which is titled Decoy Gang War Victim. And it looks very much like someone is dead on the street. And the next day, and I'm very young at the time, but I threw on a suit, shaved, got a briefcase, and I went to all the news directors in all of Los Angeles, and actually up north and a little bit south. I went to all the news directors and explained to them that I had the image of the last gang member to be killed in East Los Angeles, and many of the news programs actually produce this on their television screens. And so it was a show in the Queens Museum titled Global Conceptualism, listed this as one of the top conceptual events of the 20th century. This image is also owned by the Smithsonian. It's also owned by the Whitney Museum. This image has traveled all around the world and was actually on the front cover of Art Forum, which is the international art magazine. And so this particular image also is currently on the roster of several dissertations that are being worked on right now, because it had sort of, again, that kind of interjecting a particular point of view that affects the flow and the trajectory of culture. And again, which is really what I maybe might have had thought of early on. For instance, this work here was taken, again, this is all early OSCO stuff. We were the first generation television viewing generation. So we watched a lot of TV, and this one was actually based on an old Twilight Zone where Telly Savalas is fighting with a doll and the doll won't die. And Willie Herron, by the way, is a very great artist. And my wife is actually a very good artist. And it's only Willie Herron and my wife, Barbara Carrasco, that even if they were to fall down with a pencil in their hand, would make a perfectly straight line. It's like they can't help it. And the other artist that I worked with, Grunk at the time, is an abstract expressionist. And so this story was about a doll that would make fun of this artist that was so strict and so precise. And every time the artist would make a painting, the doll would jump and smear the painting and smear the painting. And the guy was trying everything to kill the doll, and it wouldn't die. And in the end, finally, the artist decides to become a performer. And this, again, well, now we've gone through the 70s, now this is the 80s. In the 80s, OSCO, and I'll just give you sort of a quick rundown of OSCO. OSCO started off with 4 members. There's actually a 5th member named Umberto Sandoval. He was not a visual artist, a performer. And somewhere about the 80s, it kind of grew into like a kind of messy 50 people. But it had sort of this very similar effect to a star. Star shines brightly, and then it becomes sort of this big, giant burning thing, and then it shrinks to a red dwarf. And so it was about to go into becoming a black hole eventually. And at some point, I decided that working with some of the other people that would perform, we would do these, what's known as photonovellas. It's a technique that was used in World War II. Comic book graphic artists, graphics that would include photographs, very famous in Spain and Italy. Fellini actually made a film titled White Chic based on a photonovella star. But in Mexico, very dramatic, very exciting. And I grew up reading 1950s comic books, and so it was sort of an amalgam of all of this. And so I would do performances in photonovella style in which there was a sequence of imagery in which, and this was about bag bombers, people dropping off bombs that were going to be blowing up in the city, and they're telling jokes, and they're really talking about theories, astronomical theories and biological theories and genetic theories, and they're talking about a lot of different types of scientific theories, and at the same time they're talking about the decline of capitalism, and yet they're very heartless, and they're leaving it behind, and they're posing a danger to society, and they're having fun at the same time, and they're in love, and they're kissing. And ultimately, in the end, they're operating the device while they're having a chocolate sundae at Denny's when they blow it all up. And of course, all of this series that I did for a 2-year period was all about doomed relationships. So I would do it, it was always sort of these couples that were doing different things, and of course, no animals were harmed, neither were people in the process. But the idea was that I would do these photonovellas and then project them on exterior settings in neighborhoods and homes with loudspeakers, unannounced, and people would get to watch these, and then we'd move, and there'd be pop-up presentations, and then they would just vanish. And all of OSCO's events were like that. Nothing was ever actually produced to be printed. Everything was projected. Everything was very ephemeral, which was all basically playing with the notion that we were basically all mirages. We were all a memory. We were like a ghost. We were phantoms. I created a whole series of theory based on phantom culture, which was a metaphor for Chicanos also being relegated to being phantoms in contemporary American culture. And so it was kind of this loop playing with everyone. This particular image, for me, it's kind of funny because this was created, again, in the late 70s. And El Pato is a very famous hot sauce. And so this was during a period when we would dress up in costume and makeup. And quite recently, the El Pato company said they liked it on Instagram. So yeah, but they haven't, it's very funny, 30 years later, and they haven't bought one. So we'll see if I wind up on one of their labels. And so before I lose my tang. Anyway, this image also, many of the images that I would do would always play about sort of this use of space, how you could transform a regular urban space into a performance space, and basically that's what's happening every day anyway. People enter a space, they perform an action that's expected of them, of conformity, of something that's anti-conformity. If you do something that looks a little bit different than others, and nowadays, of course, it's very dangerous to do something that seems to be a little bit too out of the ordinary because people will shoot before they ask questions. And so here we did an image on a bank location. And if you go anywhere in Los Angeles and you look on the ground, it says that it's private property and you need permission. And of course, I've never asked for permission, and I violated all the codes. And so we did this image, and this one is titled No Phantoms. And it turns out on the Tomasi Fausto collection, this wound up on the homepage of the Smithsonian's website for 10 years. So again, these kind of very obscure images somehow have been pushed to the forefront, and not only are showing my work, but it actually represents America as an art culture. I feel very fortunate to be able to join in and contribute alongside other people who have worked very hard and have been very brilliant and have created things. Of course, for instance, this piece in particular I really enjoy. This is located on a place called Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill is very important for me in particular. It's where I believe it was the unit that were the Mormons during the Mexican-American War sat atop so they could kill everybody below, all the Mexicans below. In the end, Bunker Hill was sort of a high point where very wealthy people lived at the end of the 1800s or early 1900s, and by the middle of the 20th century, it became tenement houses, and by 1968, it became so fallen apart and had 1 million people living in population, and the city leaders decided they would just bulldoze everything, which they did. They eliminated everyone out of there, left it blank for a year, and then built the financial center atop the Bunker Hill. And so one day I was walking around and I said, you know, I need to get even with these people. I'm going to get even with them. And I went to a Home Depot and I bought these rolls of plastic. And because everything has restrictions, if you look on the walls, there's restrictions. You can't take pictures, you can't walk around. Guards will come up and say things. And so I had them stretch, and I photographed it, and I called it skyscraper skin. And I knew some people at some of the local newspapers, and it published. And basically, within a week, I received letters from various lawyers demanding that I return the skin to the buildings. So, yeah, and I don't know, I guess I'm still in trouble. Let's see. And this is just someone who looked cool in the 1980s. What can I tell you? This one is also Umberto Sandoval, who's a performer. I don't have a copy here, but I once made a video with Barbara Carrasco and Umberto Sandoval and Grant called Baby Cake, which you can actually view online for free. It's put there through MoCA. It's about a baby and a mother and an absentee father. 10 years later, I made another video including Barbara and Umberto Sandoval and my son Diego, and it's about a family, a Chicano family unit that's fallen apart and having a hard time. And it was actually, he was standing in for the loser father that I could have been, but I'm not. As it turns out, gunfire broke out, a lot of really crazy things happened, and it wound up being included in the Whitney Biennial and wound up showing on Scandinavian TV, and it's been shown all around the world, and all of this was done for $50. So this one was another doomed relationship when LA had sort of a spate of mass killers. People that would come in, this was before there was fentanyl, where they still had energy. And so people would come into LA and just start killing people, and it was very weird. And LA is one of these places that draws all kinds of good and unfriendly people. And so there was a guy that was just opening doors. If your door was open, he would cut you up. And so, and this is a story about a guy that was afraid to go home because his wife liked to play rough. So, okay. So anyway, and this was another one, which is the last of the fotonovelas, and this is called X's Party, and it's a take on the word my ex, but it's an X with an apostrophe S. And here it's about a couple that is addicted to everything that's useless: reading want ads, looking at the TV, eating chocolate cake, drinking beer, whatever, except they both had powers. One could become invisible, the other one can control magnetism. Hang on for a second. And so this piece actually, believe it or not, was also presented at the Osco exhibition that took place. I forgot to mention we had a large exhibition at the LA County Museum in 2012. It turned out to be one of the largest exhibitions they've ever had. So to go from having a spray paint on the wall to have 1 million people come and look at the work, it was a vast exhibition sponsored by the Getty. And this was one of the featured pieces in which what's spelled out, and quite often in my work, what I do tend to incorporate is many philosophical theories, many forms of critique, many things of sort of inclusion and exclusion of ideas that counteract one another, so that there might be questions that are posed, and things that are very urban, and sort of a compilation of the utilization of the English language with the introduction of some Spanish, and of course Chicano speak a dialect known as Calo, which I speak also, and that's also brought into the sphere, and yet contributing to maybe some of the conclusion to some of these equations that are somewhat open-ended. And so the work actually visually, viscerally, and ephemerally affects the viewer, which then contributes to the dialogue of what will be for the rest of Los Angeles. So, so all of these, and so this one was for me kind of not too funny, because it was a story about a woman and a man that didn't want to go. They wanted to break up, but they didn't want to go. And then he reaches back, and it's an electrified fence, and they're still there. No, okay. This is a photograph of Anthony Sandoval, who's the son of Humberto Sandoval. He inherited 100% of his father's DNA. Sounds like him, talks like him. If I talk to the son, the father's talking about the same thing. If I go somewhere and have a coffee with him, he's having the same thing. And so I took a picture of the two of them 2 years apart, and you could just see the energy. They've got too much energy, and there's Dad. So there's something about, I also work with my more current work, and this is like the beginning of the 2000s. We were into a new century. And actually, this is the century of the 20th century had what was known as 20th century angst, which is this German kind of dread, this kind of feeling that something's about to happen. And the 21st century, things are happening. And the earliest part of the 21st century, people were somewhat worried and aghast. And so I kind of captured that in a whole series of photographs where people are kind of stunned. And actually, I've talked about this before, because this was also the introduction to the millennial generation, where the millennials discovered the alternative to fight or flee, and that is to become paralyzed, and which is a non-survival response to danger. Okay, and it's been proven many times if you read about it, and you must either fight or you must flee. Okay, and but to become paralyzed emotionally, economically, philosophically, in love or whatever, and of course you see this happening, and so this is what I was working with at that point. And here, for instance, I gathered what I felt were four of the best looking scholars I could find. All these people are PhDs, and had them pose also in forms of paralysis. And so I did a whole series of people that were paralyzed in space and in place, and as opposed to Osco, these people would actually pose and stay in place for an hour or two out in public. And then I would photograph them, and it became sort of a durational kind of performance with people coming by and ignoring, and it would prove that everyone in the surrounding area was also paralyzed to respond. Similar to this, where people are just kind of in a weird pose. And so, and for instance, this piece, I encased people in a pearl necklace in a doorway, blocking 300 people from entering or exiting, and no one did anything about it. And in public, and then this of course caused great consternation. People afraid to go outside, people afraid to go inside, and they were afraid to break free. And again, this they made into a 100-foot banner and was hanging somewhere in France and also in Washington, D.C. And I think the Getty made 1 million postcards, and it's fluttering somewhere all over Italy. And it's simply titled Pearls. And of course, in American society, the string of pearls and the pearl necklace has great testament to who is worthy of being engaged or who's involved in someone else, and pearls actually denote a particular element of class. And of course, some are cultured pearls, some are uncultured pearls, and some people are simply uncultured. This image was something that I photographed. One day I said, oh, well, I don't know what I'm going to do, and I just photographed some people, and I don't know, oh, here, let's just go back here. I photographed a panorama of people thinking it was a complete failure. As it turns out, big, enormous images the size of these black curtains were made, and they were displayed at all the public subway stations in LA. With everyone looking at you, and again paralyzed. And I do have some images where people that were walking out of the train stations would just stand and look at it too, and you'd have to push them to wake them up. So a lot of times, a lot of the work that I do has a tendency to create this kind of loop where there's some kind of understanding with the action and affecting sort of a deeper understanding of who you are in the present, and it's really playing with existentialism also. And going all the way back to this notion, existentialism, of course, coming to the fore after the explosion of the first nuclear bomb, and the understanding that we're at a very precarious place, and one better take action to defend yourself and to protect yourself, and the best way to do it is to become fully educated, which is why I'm so happy you're all here. You need to become smarter and brighter and really fulfilling of your own complete capacity, and to not to negate your creativity at the same time, and to understand to fulfill your existence as a human being and to have a great life at the same time, and to accept everyone and to not accept the abuse of other people. And Tomas bringing up, for instance, the fact that we do have children in cages today. It's absolutely disgusting. If you read a little bit about what's going on, they have children floating in their own shit, their piss, in their blood, you name it, the worst mistreatment since World War II. And our country fought against that, and it's here now. And it's really unfortunate, because all those children look like my grandkids. They look like me when I was a kid. And of course, I'm waiting for those children to grow up, go to college, become judges, and we will have Nuremberg trials too. This kind of enters a new phase. This was something I call virtual verite. It was my performance group, it was a performance group that never was a group, actually. But what it was is everyone in the group suddenly became off kilter, off balance. And so in order to create balance, you have to be unbalanced. And if you're standing like that, you're not going to be standing too long. But in the moment, you're kind of off. And so I kind of focus more on the usage of space and architecture and again, sort of the encroachment of wealth to push people out. And of course, I call it gentrification and other kinds of things that take place where things that were normally public are now private, where people had worked and gave their taxes, and now it's been taken away from the public and you can no longer use it, and actually, which means that the people have been robbed and things have been stolen from them, and the only way to counteract that is to maybe counteract that. And so here we have some going through a tunnel. This piece, of course, was a big hit in Houston, Texas. I'm not sure why exactly, but this piece was reproduced 100,000 times in big, giant pieces. But it's the idea that people are witnessing something, some distraction, some destruction, some horrific act. Again, kind of ready to respond, but not quite really. And at the same time, taking in the blast effect. And then here we're just going to cut really quickly. I've also worked on a series of black and white series that became very famous, currently on display at the National Portrait Gallery right now in Washington, D.C., called Chicano Male Unbonded. I have, this is Juan Felipe Herrera, who was a national poet laureate. I met him many years ago. This is Luis Perez from Los Lobos. Many different people. I have photographed maybe 100 or so people, including your professor, Tomas Carrasco here, for my series. And what it is I have photographed Chicano men who I feel have great ethics and stature, and have had something to offer to the American landscape as well as the global cultural awareness. And I have photographed them out at night using available light to create somewhat of a film noir effect as you might encounter them on the street. Early on, this created a very strange effect. Somewhere, I started in 1991, I'm still doing this work. Somewhere in the late 1990s, I showed 25 of these in Phoenix. I went off to go change. I used to shave my head at the time. When I went back to the museum, they wouldn't let me in because I looked too much like the guys on the wall. So I had to come in the back way. But the idea was that many people have asked me, very similar to what was said to me in 1972, when you see these different men on the wall and you go to these different cities, they would say, well, what gang is this? But you look at the names of the different individuals, and most of the people I know have PhDs, they're artists, they're writers, they're physicians, they do different types of things. People who I know personally are the only people on there, or maybe even my father or my son who served 15 years in the US Navy. And so, and here, for instance, is Rupert Garcia, who actually served in Vietnam and is actually a world-famous artist. And both of us gave a lecture together recently at the Smithsonian. And he's done many different types of things. He's a really tough guy, but he's a really pro-peace activist now. And this is Willie Herron, one of the original OSCO members, who hasn't taken off his sunglasses since 1982. And I'm not kidding you, he never has. So. This also is kind of part of the more recent kind of work that I've done. And this was for an essay that I wrote for a peer-reviewed journal. And this was about gathering a group of people. And this was at the time where we're going to have that big full solar eclipse, when they went from city to city showing it on the news. And I've done a little bit of studying. And of course, during the complete solar eclipse, that's when military, that's when scientists undertake certain actions because that moment doesn't exist otherwise. And so this was all a story about what can you do in that little brief moment during an eclipse, and they did it, whatever it was that I had them do. And so they're waiting for it to eclipse. And again, the thing about my performance troupe of the virtual verite, I made sure that I use everyone who I know personally who seems to have the highest IQ of all the people who I do know. So all of these people are actually on the go. They're all doing things. These are all people you're going to recognize in the future. These are all people that are writing books, doing things. They're artists, they're scientists, they're makers, they're activists. And these are not just your, these are people that are super high performing people, which is why I refer to them as performers. They are high performers, okay? And so here they are just before the eclipse. And so maybe we're getting towards the end here. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I bumped into a guy who said, oh, I'm very happy, they're giving me $1 million. I go, really, you should be happy. And they were, well, yeah, you know. And so this guy was going to get an art project funded for $1 million because they were about to destroy what's known as the 6th Street Bridge, which was like the #1 landmark in all of Los Angeles. It's been in 1 million movies. You might want to look at the movie called Point Blank. It's a really great film. Starring Lee Marvin, by the way. This bridge was a connector between East Los Angeles and downtown Los Angeles, built in the early 1930s. It was an asymmetrical bridge to make you happy you were leaving East LA in the first place. But it became very part of the folklore, and they decided they were going to knock it down and replace it with a $1 billion bridge, which was really the announcement that the whole region is about to be gentrified, which is the Arts District and Boyle Heights. And, oh, what happened? Did I turn it off somehow? How do I turn this back on again? Oh, there you go. There you go. Thank you. So when I found out that we're going to be destroying the bridge, I decided that I would bring performers to the bridge, and we would do different actions, ephemeral actions, and I use about 150 different people to perform, to walk, to dance, to fight, to laugh, to roll around, to kiss, to crawl, all the things I've done on that bridge. And so every time I went, there was less and less bridge. So for instance, this thing that looks almost like the Parthenon only lasted 6 hours. And here we have people pulling, and this was titled The Sixth Expanse. It became a book. It became part of many lectures. I've actually done extensive lectures on public space in Europe, in Belgium, in Brussels, and at the University of Stockholm based on this. And here we have Umberto Sandoval, and here you could see that the bridge is already destroyed. There's no way you could pass that little section there. And finally, when the LA Times came out to report on this bridge, by the time they came and I invited the LA Times to show up, they did a really lengthy feature on it. The bridge was completely gone. And so the article was all about how I had built a community of brilliant young people, how I got them together, and they amongst themselves started to form companies, form ideas, form their own art groups, started to reach out also to teach and to mentor other people and how to utilize public space. And this is a really famous one. This is a continuation of a story that I did known of the quinceañera. And it's basically a girl that got lost on her 15th birthday and wandered off for 10 years and returned when she's 25. It was too late for her quinceañera. And so she keeps appearing in her quinceañera dress wherever she is, and it's displaced, but every time people love to dance with her and talk to her, and she's learning along the way, and she contributes her stories. And so here she's on the bridge, and this has appeared in many magazines, by the way. And again, and this is from, okay, so when I go to Europe, I kind of continue with what I do. So this is in Antwerp, and this took place shortly after some very horrific thing took place at the Brussels airport, which I won't bring up the word there. But the whole city was covered in police tape, and in Belgium, please don't break the law, because if they put you in jail, you are immediately sent back to the Dark Ages. So we were playing with police tape, which they've never heard of doing. And I had them doing this because it was also playing with borders. In a way, this is the point where they're having the influx of refugees coming into Europe, which of course many of the problems that exist today. But everyone who's in this photograph, who somewhat looks European here, they have families that have been living there for 10,000 years. They are the indigenous people of Europe, and they're very friendly, and they're very cool, and they're very brilliant. This guy here has his PhD. He did his PhD on the happenings. His name is Stefan Wouters, and so my troupe, Virtual Verite, extended into Europe, where I had members from Paris and Berlin and other major cities in Europe, as well as Mexico City and Guadalajara. And so it became sort of a worldwide, and in the group, of course, were people from all over areas of Africa and Korea and China. And so here they are, and that actually is a violation of the current EU laws. So, you know, they all walked away calmly, though. And here it is. Everyone's teaching the girl to dance properly. And actually in the middle right here, I just want to congratulate Chris Velasco, who received his MFA at the University of Santa Barbara this last summer. And there he is dancing. This is towards the end here. A couple years ago, I wrote a book on a small section of LA County. That day, they shut down all flights at LAX. The airspace was declared dead because they were about to fire some kind of nuclear weapon into the sky. They told everyone in Los Angeles, don't look at it. Of course, everyone looked at it. But that day, I had, again, this is someone who received her MFA in art, fly a paper airplane, a Mylar airplane, in which she wrote words of peace and flew it all through the neighborhood. And so she flew it by hand in a very peaceful manner. And later that evening, a weapon of mass destruction flew over the sky above us. And here's one last thing. I was the artist in residence of the Getty. I'm probably the only one they've ever allowed to just take a painting out on a cruise. I decided I would take Irises by Van Gogh. I know that Van Gogh never saw a freeway, and so I wanted him to go and see the freeway. So, and somewhere I have a video here, you'll see, yeah, we put it back neatly, you know, and I decided to use irises because on a previous adventure to the Getty in about 2000, I had two performers, Paulina Salgun and Francesco Siqueiros. Somehow, well, I'm always able to talk people into things. They allowed me to have two people dance with sledgehammers in hand, and they were trying to kill each other, and in the end, they poked holes in the walls right next to irises and on the floor, and we nearly knocked down a Greek antiquity, and we held it up. And of course, I was told never to come back, and I signed a non-disclosure agreement. 15 years later, everyone who was involved in that had quit or been fired, and they forgot I was ever thrown out, so I was allowed to go back. So the French find this to be very, they just couldn't believe this was happening, but I thought this was quite fun. This was titled Macaroon. This was sort of a print media photonovela in which a couple is licking, having a sexual encounter with macaroons. Yeah, so please close your eyes if you're, and so here's the last one. About a year and a half ago, I was the instructor of a large a think tank in Brussels, and had all these European PhDs come, and so I had them go out into the streets. And I don't know if you go to Belgium, they will hand you a packet of iodine to take because many of their nuclear reactors are not defended properly and because of the problems that they have. And you could take it or you could not take it, but if you take it, if something goes wrong, it will prevent you from needing to go to the doctor, apparently. And so the big threat was that things might happen. And so I had everyone kind of pretending what would happen if a nuclear blast were to take place. It turns out I put them all in different places of the city, and when they did this, and when I turned them all into human barricades, we started blocking traffic. I had them piled up on the street, and we had to stop when the soldiers showed up with bayonets. But of course, we want peace. Thank you.
All right, let's give them a round of applause.